41 people stood in the fluorescent glare of the Harwick Industries lobby the morning they tried to end Mason Holt's life. Not his life, his livelihood, his name. 41 applicants in pressed suits and polished shoes, every one of them younger than the industry they were trying to enter, every one of them holding a leather portfolio like it was a shield. Then the side door opened and Mason walked in. Worn canvas jacket, steel-toed boots with a crack along the left heel. And behind him, holding his hand with both of hers, a 6-year-old girl named Ellie, clutching a small orange stuffed fox named Cog. The laughter started before he reached the reception desk. Someone said it looked like Bring Your Kid to a Job Fair Day. Someone else said he must have the wrong building. He did not look up. He did not stop. What happened in the next 3 hours would not just end the laughter. It would shut down the entire factory floor. Stay with this one. The woman behind the reception desk had the careful expression of someone trained never to show surprise. She showed it anyway. Her name was Grace, and she had worked the front desk at Harwick for 11 years, and she had never once seen a man walk into a professional interview with a child on his arm and a fox stuffed with cotton under that child's chin. She asked for his name. He said it quietly, Mason Holt. She typed it. She looked at her screen. She looked at him. She typed it again. Ellie pressed Cog against her cheek and looked up at the woman with the careful face. She did not fidget. She did not speak. She simply watched, the way 6-year-olds watch things they are still deciding about. The lobby held 41 people and Mason was the 42nd. He was also the only one who had been scheduled. The others were walk-ins, overflow from a mass interview notice that Harwick's HR department had sent without reading the fine print at the bottom. The fine print said, "This position has already been offered pending one final evaluation." Mason Holt was the final evaluation. He did not know that. He had simply come because they called, and he always came when he was called because that was the kind of man he was. He found a seat near the window. He set his bag on the floor. He helped Ellie up onto the chair beside him, and she arranged Cog in her lap with the focused seriousness of someone completing an important task. She then opened the small zip pouch in Mason's bag and took out a set of colored pencils and a folded piece of paper, and she began to draw. She drew without looking up. She always drew. Her mother had drawn. That was 3 years ago. Before the accident, before the paperwork. Before Mason learned what it meant to be a single man with a daughter and a mortgage and a skill set, the world kept telling him was either invisible or unwanted. The door to the inner corridor opened at exactly 9:14 in the morning, and the man who came through it was not the HR director. His name was Dominic Carr. He was 47 years old, silver-haired, wearing a suit that cost more than Mason's monthly rent. He was the chief operations officer of Harwick Industries, and he had a handshake that came slightly too fast and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He looked at the room of 41. He looked at Mason. His expression did not change, but something behind it did. He pointed at Mason. Not at anyone else. At Mason specifically. He said, "Who let the maintenance crew in here?" The room laughed. Not everyone, but enough. Enough that the sound filled the lobby and bounced off the glass doors and landed somewhere in the space between Mason's shoulder blades. Mason did not laugh. He did not tighten. He looked at Dominic Carr with the flat, unhurried attention of someone who has been underestimated so many times that it no longer registers as an insult. It registers as information. Ellie looked up from her drawing. She looked at the man in the expensive suit. She looked at her father. She pressed Cog a little tighter and looked back down at her paper. She drew a fox with very careful ears. Dominic Carr gestured for Mason to follow him. The other 41 applicants watched. Some of them smirked. Some of them looked away. One woman near the back, a younger analyst named Madison who had been with Harwick for 8 months, watched Mason stand and pick up his bag and take Ellie's hand, and she felt something she couldn't name yet, something that sat wrong in her chest. The corridor was long and gray and smelled of industrial cleaner. Dominic walked ahead. Mason walked behind. Ellie walked beside her father with Cog tucked under one arm, her colored pencils still in her free hand. They passed a window overlooking the factory floor below. Mason slowed for half a step. He looked through the glass. The floor was running. Conveyor lines, assembly stations, hydraulic presses cycling in rhythm. He noted something. He said nothing. He kept walking. The office they were brought to was not a small office. It had a long table and 8 chairs and a woman standing at the far end of it who was not what Mason had been told to expect. Her name was Claire Harwick. She was 31 years old. She had inherited the company from her father 16 months ago under a board that had given her exactly 1 year to prove she could run it, and she had spent every one of those months proving it with the kind of focused aggression that comes from having something to lose. She was not a cruel woman. She was a pressured one. There is a difference, even when it doesn't look like one from the outside. She looked at Mason when he came through the door. She looked at Ellie. She looked at Cog. She looked at Dominic. Dominic said, "This is the independent contractor from the patent filing." He said it like it was a sentence that explained everything and forgave itself at the same time. Claire looked back at Mason. She said, "Mr. Holt, I'm going to be direct with you. This evaluation was a formality. The position has been filled." Mason set his bag down. He said, "All right." She said, "I don't know how you got this far in the process without someone catching the conflict. The patent you filed overlaps with proprietary Harwick technology. We're going to need to discuss that with our legal team. You'll never work in this industry again. I want to be clear about that." The room was quiet. Not the quiet of nothing happening. The quiet of a room where everyone has stopped pretending. Ellie looked up. She looked at the woman with the sharp eyes. She looked at her father. She placed Cog carefully on the table in front of her, ears up, watching, and she picked up her pencil and kept drawing. Mason looked at Claire Harwick for a long moment. He said, "Can I ask which patent?" Dominic said, "You know which one." Mason said, "I'd like to hear it from her." Claire said, "Patent number 741-992B, the thermal regulation compression system, filed under your name 18 months ago." Mason said, "I know the patent." She said, "Then you know the problem?" He said, "I know one version of it." He reached into his bag. He did not pull anything out yet. He simply kept his hand there, on the edge of something, and looked at Dominic Carr, and the look he gave him was not angry, not cold, something older than that, something that had been waiting. Dominic said, "I'd suggest you leave quietly, Mr. Holt, for your daughter's sake." Mason looked at Ellie. She was drawing. Her pencil moved in slow, careful arcs. She was drawing the room. She was drawing the table. She was drawing a fox with very careful ears sitting in the center of all of it. He said, "She's fine." He had been 29 when he filed the patent. He was 32 now. In those 3 years, he had buried his wife, learned to braid hair badly and then less badly, learned which brand of chicken nuggets Ellie would eat and which ones she called wrong chicken, learned how to run a household on a mechanic's wage while paying the fees on a patent application his wife had told him to file before she got too sick to nag him about it anymore. The patent had come from 6 years of work, not theoretical work, hands and grease work. Mason had spent those 6 years as a maintenance engineer for a mid-sized manufacturing plant in Westfield, fixing the same thermal failures in the same compression systems 3 times a year, and after the 3rd year he had stopped fixing them and started redesigning them. He had done it on his own time, on his own dime, in a rented workspace above a garage on Elm Cross Road where the landlord was a retired machinist named Benjamin who came upstairs some evenings to watch and never said much and sometimes brought coffee. Benjamin knew. He had always known. The patent was real. The application was complete. The documentation was 112 pages long, including test data, material specifications, and a cover letter Mason had written and rewritten 11 times because his wife kept saying it needed to sound more like him. It sounded like him. It was quiet and specific, and it did not brag. Dominic Carr had seen it 14 months ago, not because Mason had shown it to him, because someone inside the patent office had flagged it, a routine overlap search. And the flag had landed on Dominic's desk because Dominic had a contact inside the office who sent him flags, because that was the kind of man Dominic was. He had sat on it. He had then filed a competing application under a subsidiary name with specifications that were not identical but were close enough to create confusion, and he had buried the subsidiary inside a holding company that had no visible connection to Harwick Industries. Claire Harwick did not know any of this. Madison, the analyst in the back left corner of the room, was beginning to suspect some of it because she had spent 3 weeks pulling procurement records for a board audit and some of the supplier names had not matched and she had written it in a notebook she kept in her second desk drawer. She had not said anything yet. The factory floor ran below them. The conveyor lines cycled. The hydraulic presses breathed in and out. At 11 minutes past 10, the first press stopped. Then the second. Then the third line went silent, and the silence came up through the building like a held breath. Everyone in the room heard it. Claire Harwick looked at Dominic. He was already on his phone. She looked at Mason. He was looking at the window. She said, "What just happened?" He said, "Thermal overload on the compression regulators. 3rd line first, then it'll cascade to the others. You've got about 12 minutes before the hydraulic pressure drops below operating threshold and you lose the whole floor for 6 to 8 hours. She said, "How do you know that?" He said, "Because I spent 4 years watching it happen." She looked at Dominic. He was talking low and fast into his phone. She looked back at Mason. She said, "Can you fix it?" He said, "Yes." She said, "How long?" He said, 9 minutes if I have access to the regulator housing." Dominic ended his call. He said, "Our engineering team is on their way. We don't need a contractor walking our floor." Claire looked at him. She looked at Mason. She looked at Ellie, who had set down her pencil and was watching her father with the calm, complete attention of someone who has seen this before. Who knows what comes next? Claire said, "Go." Mason picked up his bag. He looked at Ellie. He said, "Stay with this lady, okay?" He touched the top of her head. He said, "Keep working on the fox." Ellie picked up Cog and set him in her lap. She said, "Okay, Dad." He left the room. He was gone for 8 minutes and 40 seconds. The factory floor was louder in person than it looked from the window. Even stopped, it had a sound, the residual hum of cooled metal, the drip of hydraulic fluid, the distant click of thermal sensors cycling through error states. Mason moved through it without hesitation. He knew the layout not because he had studied the Harwick floor plan, which he hadn't, but because thermal compression systems in manufacturing floors of this age and type followed one of 3 configurations, and he had fixed all 3 of them more times than he could count. He found the regulator housing on the south wall behind a secondary coolant station, exactly where it would be. He opened it with a flathead he carried in his jacket pocket because he always carried a flathead. He looked at what was inside. He did not look for long. He worked, not quickly, not slowly, with the specific economy of motion that comes from doing a thing so many times that it no longer requires thought, only attention. His hands moved. The sensors clicked. The hum of the floor began to change. At 8 minutes and 30 seconds, the first press restarted. By 9 minutes, the second line was cycling. By the time he came back through the corridor door and into the conference room, all 3 lines were running. The room had acquired 3 more people. 2 of them were Harwick engineers who had arrived 90 seconds after Mason left and had stood in the corridor unsure what to do. The third was Benjamin Cole, 71 years old, retired machinist, Mason's landlord on Elm Cross Road. He was sitting in a chair against the wall with his cap in his hands, and when Mason came through the door, he looked up and gave a very small nod. Claire Harwick was standing at the window. She had been watching the floor. She turned when he came in. She said, "How?" He said the bypass valve on the secondary regulator was running a thermal differential outside spec. It's a design flaw. It's been there since the line was built. I can show you the documentation. She said, "What documentation?" He reached into his bag. He set a folder on the table. It was not a slim folder. It was 112 pages held together with a binder clip slightly worn at the edges, the cover page typed in plain 12-point font. He set it on the table the way you set something down when you have been carrying it for a very long time and you are finally in the right room. He said, "This is the original patent filing, not a copy. The original with the USPTO stamp on page 1 and the submission receipt on page 112. If you compare the specifications on pages 44 through 61 to the design of your current regulator system, you'll find they're the same." Claire did not pick it up yet. Dominic said, "This is a fabrication." He said it firmly. He said it the way men say things when they have spent a long time being certain. Benjamin Cole looked up from his chair. He said, "No, it isn't." He said it quietly. He said, "I watched him write every page of that. I watched him test every figure. I have his workshop logs going back 6 years, and I'll put them on any table in any courtroom you'd like to name." Dominic looked at Benjamin. He looked at Mason. Something moved behind his eyes. Madison, in the back left corner, opened her notebook. She set it on the table without speaking. She turned it to a page near the middle. She pushed it toward Claire Harwick. The page had a column of supplier names and a column of subsidiary IDs and a column of dates, and 3 of the dates had circles around them in blue ink, and beside the circles she had written a question mark and a name. The name was a holding company. The holding company was registered in Delaware. The registration documents listed 1 officer. His name was Dominic Carr. The room was quiet. Not the quiet of nothing happening. The quiet of a thing that has been true for a long time being said out loud for the first time. Dominic stood. He said, "This is not the time or place." Claire said, "Sit down." He did not sit down. She said it again. "Sit down, Dominic." He sat. She picked up Mason's folder. She opened it to page 1. She looked at the USPTO stamp. She looked at the submission date. She turned to page 44. She read. She turned to page 45. She read. She turned pages slowly, carefully, the way you turn pages when you are not reading for information but for the specific weight of something true. She closed the folder. She looked at Dominic for a long time. She said, "You filed against this patent." He said, "Claire, there are legal complexities here that," she said, "under a subsidiary company you own personally." He said, "The acquisition strategy was," she said, "while you were my COO." He stopped talking. She said, "While you were sitting at my table and telling me the patent risk was real and the contractor was a problem." She looked at Madison. She said, "Call legal. Tell them I need 2 people in this room in 10 minutes. She said, "Call security. Tell them I need someone at this door." She looked at Mason. She said, "Mr. Holt." And then she stopped. She looked at him properly. the way she perhaps should have looked at him when he first walked through the door, before the lobby and the suits and the polish of 41 people who had the right packaging and nothing inside it. She said, "I owe you an apology." He said, "You didn't know." She said, "I should have. And I told you that you'd never work in this industry again. I said that to you. I want to be clear that I was wrong. I was wrong because I took his word for it. I was wrong because I looked at you and I decided before you spoke. I was wrong and I'm sorry." She said it without deflection, without softening, without the particular cowardice of people who apologize for how something made you feel instead of for what they did. Mason looked at her. He said, "All right." Ellie had been quiet through all of it. She had been drawing. She had filled the entire page with the conference room, the table, the chairs, the window, the factory floor visible below, the people standing, the folder on the table, Cog sitting at the center of it all. She was 6 years old and she drew rooms the way her mother had drawn rooms, which was to say she drew everything that was actually there, not just the things you were supposed to notice. She looked up now. She looked at the woman who had said I was wrong and she said one thing. She said, "My dad fixes things because they need fixing, not because somebody asks." The room held that. Claire Harwick looked at this child, this small person with a stuffed fox in her lap and colored pencils in her hand, and something in her expression shifted. She did not cry. But she came very close to it. She came around the edge of the table. She lowered herself, not all the way, but low enough. She bent her knees and brought herself to Ellie's level, and she looked at her directly, and she said, "I know. I see that now." Ellie looked at her for a moment. Then she looked at Cog. Then she picked up Cog and held him out toward Claire, not to give him away, but to show her the way you show someone something important when you want to make sure they really see it. She said, "His name is Cog. He's very good at keeping secrets." Claire looked at the fox with the careful ears. She said, "I'll bet he is." 2 weeks later, Mason signed a licensing agreement that gave Harwick Industries the right to use his thermal regulation system across their entire manufacturing line, along with a consulting contract that paid him more in a month than he had made in a year, and a formal acknowledgement of prior patent ownership that would be entered into the public record. Dominic Carr was escorted from the building the same afternoon the legal team finished their review. The subsidiary was dissolved. The matter was referred to the relevant authorities. He did not give a statement. Benjamin drove Mason and Ellie home that evening. It was a quiet drive. Ellie fell asleep in the back seat with Cog on her chest, his ears pointing up at the roof of the car. Benjamin drove with both hands on the wheel and said very little, which was his way. When they got back to the house on Randall Street, Mason carried Ellie inside and settled her in her bed without waking her. He set Cog beside her pillow. He stood in the doorway for a moment looking at her, the way you look at the thing you are most afraid of losing and most grateful you still have. He went downstairs. He made 2 pieces of toast because there was bread that needed using. He buttered them both. He set one on a plate and one in his hand, and he ate, standing at the counter in the quiet kitchen where a sketchbook was still tucked in the 3rd drawer from the left, where it had been for 3 years, because he could not move it, and could not open it, and could not throw it away, and all 3 of those things were okay for now. He washed his plate. He dried his hands on the dish towel with the yellow stripe. He turned off the kitchen light. He went back upstairs to check on Ellie. She was still asleep. Cog was still beside her. His ears were still pointing up.